you very much. Senator Risch.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First line of questioning from Mr. Gross. I'm always struck that every time we see a Russian poisoning case, they use the same poison all the time, it seems like, and it's also one that is easily identifiable and traced back to the FSB or one of their agencies. I'm assuming this is done to send a message as much as anything else, that they're doing this and they're not trying to do it secretly. They want people to understand what they've done. Am I right in that assessment?
That is a good of an analysis as anyone. We don't know what exactly is in their head, but my conclusion is that they have an optional approach. They are trying to use a weapon that they continually improve over the years and invest millions and millions in making more efficient, on the hope that it may remain undiscovered. But in the case it gets discovered, it has such a scary reputation that it achieves a different outcome, which is fear and intimidation. So they win from their point of view either way. If it remains undiscovered, they win. If it gets discovered and it points to them, they also win. They have zero reputation cost, and thus you're right that they don't mind being discovered.
Well, and on top of that, the Russians are notorious that when they do get caught red-handed, whatever they're doing, they just lie about it. A good example, that's the invasion of Ukraine. They get on TV all the time and say, well, this wasn't our fault. America did this. America caused this. It's phenomenal that they can do that, and yet people shrug their shoulders and walk away from it. So anyway, well, listen, for all three of you, I have a question that I'd like to, perhaps a general answer, and time's limited, so if you'd give me as brief an answer as you could, I would appreciate it. I think we're at a point on the planet where countries are deciding which club they're going to belong to. Is it a freedom and democracy and a government that is created by the people and operated by the people and disciplined by the people, or is it a dictatorship, an autocracy? And of course, the two governments operate very, very differently. And I note that none of the cases that have been referred to here today come from democratic countries. They come from the autocracies. So I think that our challenge as human beings in this century, in the 21st century, is going to be trying to figure out how the two groups of countries exist on this planet without killing each other. Because I think one thing we can all agree on, North Korea, Iran, China, they're not going to change. They're going to be the same for a long, long time to come, for the foreseeable future. You hope that there's some change, but hope, as we all know, isn't much of a strategy. And the democracies are not going to change. We're not going to change. Great Britain's not going to change. The countries that make up those the group of free countries aren't going to change. So the conduct we're talking about specifically in this hearing are small instances, and I say that not to demean them, because when I say small, I mean compared to a war like what's going on in Ukraine or in Israel. They're a unique, specific incident. They wind up in a newspaper reporting. Everybody reads it and what have you, but they turn the page and move on to sports or something else. So how do we deal with these? From country to country, how do we as a country deal with these? With the countries who perpetrate that and other free countries, without going to war over them, obviously. And there needs to be some kind of discipline. There needs to be some kind of accountability. But how do you do that? What's your recommendation in how we deal with these? Let's go down the ideas just like we started. Mr. Gross, if you'd start.
Very briefly, and I've said this before, I would advocate for invoking the principle of universal jurisdiction whenever feasible to investigate crimes that otherwise remain uninvestigated, because bad actors are not going to investigate themselves. So many countries have the principle of universal jurisdiction. Partly the United States can invoke it, but a crime that happens across several countries outside of the United States and has its core, its basis of an action decided in Moscow can still be prosecuted, but it is not at the moment. Everybody delivers the benefit of the principle of judicial sovereignty to bad actors. And this is one way that it, I think, can be somewhat curtailed. But you also pointed out that not every country is in the camp of either the bad actor or the good actor. Some countries are borderline. They're nominally democracies, and they are in many respects democracies, but they sometimes are afraid of taking action against China or Russia because of economic pressures. And those are very insidious non-actions sometimes. For example, Bulgaria, Hungary, Georgia, the country of Georgia, within certain governments are afraid to prosecute Russian crime or Chinese crime that happens on their territory. And such non-actions actually can be sanctioned. Sanctions can be imposed against the people not prosecuting by the United States. So these are two examples I could see as very practical.
I'm out of time, but briefly, Mr. Abramowitz.
Thank you for the question. A couple points I'd like to make. First of all, I think since Freedom House began reporting on this phenomenon 3 or 4 years ago, I think that democratic governments have actually begun to kind of be much more aware of the problem and to actually do things about it. Is it perfect? No. But you see law enforcement agencies like the Justice Department, Homeland Security, the FBI, their agents are being educated about the problem. They're noticing these cases that they might not have noticed before. We talk with Western democracies as well. They are really beginning to be much more focused on this issue. There's not like a silver bullet, Senator, with this. I think that we have in my testimony I outlined a range of different things: sanctions, visa bans, the creation of tip lines for people to tip off law enforcement. This is going to be a generational struggle, I think. Russia, as you pointed out, Russia and China are not going anywhere. Other countries are choosing sides now. And I think what's really important is for particularly the United States government and other democracies to make clear that this is unacceptable behavior and to not sweep this under the rug. So when, especially, people that are friendly to the United States, I mentioned India and Saudi Arabia, and these are, in Saudi Arabia is a significant perpetrator of transnational repression. We've had 2 big cases that have been outlined from India recently. This should be a matter that is in the bilateral relationship. And if it's seen as being swept under the rug, then I think other governments will not take it as seriously.
Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The People's Republic of China has committed a despicable campaign of genocide against the Uyghur people and has exported its oppression to target ethnic and religious minority groups and their family members globally. Since 1997, members of the Uyghur diaspora have experienced the long reach of the PRC's authoritarianism in the form of unprovoked harassment, intimidation, and coercion. Communities in our own nation are victims of China's repression. Mr. Abramowitz, how do China's tactics differ and remain unpublicized compared to other countries when it is the key enabler of transnational repression?
Senator, China is the world leader on transnational repression. That's been very clear from our reports, from the work that my colleagues have done. They conduct the most sophisticated, global, and comprehensive campaign of transnational repression in the world. I would say that China's
Is your mic on?
By 3 particular noteworthy trends. Number one,
Thank you. Number one, the campaign targets many groups: ethnic and religious minorities, political dissidents, human rights activists, journalists, and former insiders. It's the full range of tactics that they use, from direct attacks like kidnapping dissidents, co-opting other countries to detain their dissidents, and also, in the case of the Uyghurs that you outlined, really threatening their families to get their family members who are living in the free world to basically shut up. Finally, the sheer breadth and global scale of the campaign is incredible, and outspoken members of the Hong Kong diaspora have found themselves in the dragnet, as have many others. So it's really the number one country, the number one perpetrator.
How can the United States help support governments to combat China's repression of minority groups abroad? And, for example, can Magnitsky sanctions be utilized to hold the perpetrators, enabling China's transnational repression accountable?
We've certainly been in favor of the greater use of the Magnitsky sanctions to target individuals. We think that there can be changes to the law to make perpetrators of transnational repression, more squarely within the focus of the sanction regime. I would also say, I think it's very difficult to influence China directly, but one of the themes that we've looked at Freedom House over the last 5 years is China's efforts to, co-opt international fora like the Human Rights Council in Geneva. It's really important for the United States to really combat China's efforts in fora like that.
Russia imprisons dissenters like Vladimir Kara-Murza and Alexander Navalny that threaten Putin's power, and it shuts down independent media to control the behavior and flow of information to its citizens. But sadly, Russia's repression doesn't stop within its borders. In 2022, Russia journalist Evgenia Balatarova fled to Kazakhstan after Russian police searched her house due to her online presence in opposition to Russia's illegal war against Ukraine. Kazakh authorities then detained her when they learned of the criminal charges against her and told her she wasn't allowed to leave Kazakhstan. Mr. Groves, have there been widespread transnational repression activities targeting Russian journalists and media services who move abroad after Russia invaded Ukraine?
Yes, I gave example with at least three cases where Russian journalists have been targeted or activists have been targeted abroad with assassination attempts, which may have intended to just be inconclusive assassination attempts, just to send a shiver down the spine of other journalists. Women were selected, in my view, specifically because of the terror from a Russian perspective of the fact that they're not stopping at gender or boundary. And we've seen more attempts than the three, but the three are conclusively linked to chemical weapons that we believe are only in the hands of Russia. So we've seen attempts by Russian authorities to force countries that are nominally democratic to extradite Russians that are in those countries. Kazakhstan is one example, but Bulgaria is another example. Austria is another example. So there are many attempts for judicial repression, in addition to the extrajudicial that we mentioned earlier. I think we're talking about cases that are definitely close to 100, not just one or two.
100?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, one last question. In November, the Nicaraguan regime applauded the unprecedented win of its first Miss Universe winner and called her win a moment of, quote, legitimate joy and pride. Shortly after, the director of the Miss Nicaragua pageant, Karen Celebretti, was prohibited from returning to Nicaragua, and her husband and son in Nicaragua were detained on accusations of conspiracy dating back to 2018. Clearly, the Ortega regime intends to use such tactics to silence all dissenters, both within Nicaragua and abroad. Mr. Groves, how should the United States respond to the Ortega regime's intimidation of Karen Celebretti and her family?
As we discussed earlier, we believe that sanction tools such as the Magnitsky Act should not be exclusively used to countries like Russia. They can definitely be applied to the context of Nicaragua as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Ricketts.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Many Americans believe that the Chinese Communist Party is an external threat only. However, this hearing illustrates the long tentacles of authoritarian regimes like the CCP and that it knows no borders. This became obvious with the revelation that the CCP is operating secret police stations and overseas centers around the world, including here in the United States, to intimidate, threaten, and harass Chinese dissidents. While the case in New York is well known, there are reports that there could be others, including in my home state of Nebraska. This is a flagrant violation of our sovereignty and must be addressed swiftly and forcefully. But as countries have woken up to the threat, of these police stations and overseas centers, the CCP is adapted. According to a recent report by Safeguard Defenders, the CCP is running a global network of consular volunteers through its embassies and consulates who form part of the United Front influence to enforce operations on foreign soil. These consular volunteers are mostly used to help with administrative tasks linked to consular protection, risk assessments, and even warnings and advisories to overseas citizens and organizations. This gives them the full access to individuals' personal information, may also enhance their control over overseas communities and dissenters. According to the report, none of these liaisons have been declared to host country authorities by the PRC or other relevant actors, let alone receive consent. While the PRC embassies and consulates have been using these informal networks for at least a decade, they were recently formalized through a state council decree in September. Mr. Abramowitz, in your testimony, you said that host governments and law enforcement officials must pay increasing attention to the role of diplomatic staff and proxy actors working on behalf of the origin states to intimidate exiles. What role do these consular volunteers play in enhancing the CCP's ability to conduct transnational repression activities?
Senator, the honest truth is my knowledge on this issue is really from the human rights group that you cited, did very good work on that. It's deeply disturbing. We were encouraged to see, an April indictment for 2 PRC nationals arrested on suspicion of operating one such police station in New York. So this issue is beginning to kind of get greater attention. I think the point that I would just simply make is that, the 850 or so cases we've had of physical transnational oppression, the murders, the renditions, so forth, that's just the tip of the iceberg. And countries like China are employing surveillance, these police stations, spyware, just all manner of tactics. And I think it's a wake-up call for the nation.
Are there things specifically we can do with regard to these consular volunteers, or how do we work better with our allies on these?
Well, I think the one thing that comes to mind that I would suggest is that I would say if it comes to the attention of the State Department or a foreign ministry in a certain country that a diplomat is behaving outside of the normal diplomat channels, that seems to me grounds for expulsion.
In addition to formalizing consular volunteers, other parts of the CCP's new regulations on consular protection could allow it to grow into its capacity to carry out transnational repression. In Article 7 of this State Council new regulation that I mentioned, it states that the PRC embassies can act unilaterally under quote-unquote special circumstances, granted that there is permission from the host country. Under Article 7, it states the PRC embassies Article 3 rather states the consulates are responsible when, quote, the rights of Chinese nationals are violated, or simply if help is needed. The PRC might target a Chinese national abroad under almost any pretext, but these are new regulations that could provide formal grounds for the PRC consulates to intervene in overseas private affairs of Chinese nationals, whether they're welcome government support or not. What's your takeaway on this, Mr. Abramowitz, with regard to these new security rules from embassies and consulates? And are there specific things we should do in light of this new regulation that the State Council and the Chinese government has passed?
Let me just ask, if I may, I think my colleague wanted to say one thing on that.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Ms. Gallagher.
Because she had just some...
It's just following your question earlier about the overseas police stations and the consular volunteers. Just a quick point. When the NGO Safeguard Defenders published their report on Chinese police stations abroad, they received on that day an email purportedly coming from me as an international human rights lawyer in that space, saying your report is superb, I'd like to offer you my services pro bono, I'd like to help. And they engaged with that email, and after a period of time they started getting asked questions about their sources for the report. And luckily, the person who received the email at Safeguard Defenders thought something wasn't quite right and reached out to me through another source, and we discovered that it was quite a sophisticated fake. Now, that's an example of this kind of privilege fishing that I've been speaking about, where people purport to be lawyers, people who are well respected, and reach out in that way. Indeed, I've had those privilege fishing type emails from people purporting to be staffers to members of the Senate, and from people who purport to be partners in US law firms. They're very sophisticated, and it does seem to me there's a very simple step which could be taken in relation to that. The US government, of course, issued a business advisory warning US businesses of emerging risks to their operations and activities in Hong Kong in July 2021. It does seem to me these tactics of transnational repression that are being used, including that example of privilege fishing and purporting to be professionals in order to obtain sensitive information, which may put people at very serious risk, and that should obviously be the subject of quite clear guidance from the US government, it seems to us, so that people are warned about this tactic. And I, for my part, share the concerns which you raised, Senator, regarding broadly this issue. And it does also seem to me, in the US, unusually, there's obviously been criminal justice activity in relation to the overseas police stations. Many countries, there was none. There have been very few prosecutions arising from those overseas police stations, which is concerning.
Mr. Chairman, I have a follow-up question with Ms. Gallagher.
Please do.
So on these new regulations the Chinese government state councils put out with regard to the behavior of their consulates and these consular volunteers and so forth, what steps do you think we as the United States and our allies should take with regard to these new regulations that came out?
So
I would ask that you respond briefly, if you could.
Of course. I can give you a more detailed answer on that in writing subsequently, if that would be helpful.
Oh, that'd be great. Great. Thank you very much.